Filipino Americans have a rich and diverse history. However, many school curriculums do not reflect this. The following lesson plans will introduce students and teachers to the centuries-long foundational role that Filipinos have had in American history. This unit will introduce the following themes: exploitation, migration, assimilation, colonialism, internalized oppression, colonial mentality, manifest destiny, globalization, and more. By the end of this unit, students will be able to identify how America's treatment of Filipino peoples affected communities both in the United States and the Philippines, articulate the varied roles early Filipino Americans played in America's history, and evaluate the ways in which this history was either erased, masked, or misconstrued, and its modern day effects.
My name is Allison Fishbach, and I'm going to talk about our third lesson, which jumps forward in time a little bit. It's about Ramon Reyes Layla. He is the author of the 1898 book, The Philippine Islands, and that is the first English language book about the Philippines. Layla himself is a complex case study of internalized oppression. During his life, he presented himself as a native Filipino with European schooling, but the reality was that he was ethnically Indian. He was raised in Manila before moving to the United States. He leveraged his knowledge of the Philippines to satisfy the growing American curiosity for the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. But while doing so, he presented a false picture not only of himself, but of other Filipinos, presenting the Philippines as a nation that desired US control. On the screen, you can see some of the essential questions in this lesson that touch on the unit as a whole. And some of the keywords we want students to learn are things like internalized oppression, exploitation, and American exceptionalism. This unit really wants students to realize that colonialism is not only an outward force, but an inward one. In exploring Layla's work and life, there is very little secondary source scholarship, which pushes students towards developing their own conclusions from primary source documents. This lesson leverages those documents as a practice in critical thinking and discerning motives through reflection and personal experience. It also asks students to engage with complex histories and develop arguments that interact with the voices of historical figures, and to see history from the viewpoint of the oppressed. One of the highlights of this lesson is an activity that asks students to form connections between Layla's arguments for Philippine statehood and US occupation, and current debates about Puerto Rican statehood. This lesson shows students that history is not in the past, but has a direct bearing on the world that they live in today.
At the end of these 5 lessons, students will be able to explain how the patterns of Filipino migration to the United States were determined largely by immigration laws and government policies, provide an overview of early Filipino-American experiences, and explain why the military is so central to Filipino-American experiences. By highlighting the history and culture of Filipino-American communities, as well as the challenges resulting from U.S. colonialism and discrimination that they have endured, these lessons will help students develop a deep appreciation and respect for these communities and their indispensable contributions.
Welcome to Lesson 2, Filipino Americans, Cannery and Farm Laborers. When the United States won the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its long-held colony of the Philippines to the United States. Since the U.S. had annexed the Philippines, Filipino workers were initially exempt from the exclusion laws, a series of anti-Asian legislation that had recently slowed the flow of Chinese and Japanese workers, who often worked the menial jobs in canneries and seasonal farm work. Taking advantage of this special status, Filipinos began emigrating to Seattle in the 1910s, replacing previous waves of Chinese and Japanese workers. By the 1920s, some 3,000 were arriving annually to find work. Filipino immigrants at this time were almost all male and without their families, so these workers took part in the freewheeling Wild West of the day. Instead of gold, many of these young male immigrants hoped to earn an education. The International District in Seattle was the cultural heart of the Chinese, Japanese, and now Filipino workers. There you could see fashionably dressed young Filipino men exchanging news from the frontiers where they worked, going to films, eating at restaurants, and dancing and singing at the music halls. However, despite taking part in these characteristically American activities, Filipino workers, like the Chinese and Japanese before them, continued to be hired for only the worst and most dangerous jobs. In 1933, the Alascaros, who were Filipino cannery workers in the Alaskan canneries, founded the first Filipino-led union called the Cannery Workers and Farm Laborers Union Local 18257. Chinese workers in the same hard and dangerous situation had tried to unionize earlier without success. However, the Great Depression and the anti-Filipino race riots in the Kashmir and Yakamina Valley in 1827 through 1828, in which many Filipino agricultural workers were killed and their bunkhouses destroyed by fire, helped turn public opinion and allowed workers to begin to protect themselves through organization.
My lesson plan is on the naturalization of Filipinos who fought in World War II and the war brides. Ever since the U.S. annexation of the Philippines, Filipinos have served disproportionately in the American military. From units fighting against Filipino rebels resisting American colonialism, to serving in the U.S. Navy during World War I, to battling in resistance to and the eventual overthrow of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, Filipino servicemen and servicewomen defended America and American interests through service in the armed forces. However, while America depended significantly on Filipinos in the military during the early 20th century, it also devalued that service, rescinding promised benefits, including paths to citizenship, through legislation. This unit teaches students about the basis of the fight for full equity and the changes in immigration and naturalization driven by governmental decree, including the ways in which Filipino fighters and their families benefited, and how the U.S. reneged on promises to hundreds of thousands of others. Students will understand why the benefits promised were and are important, and gain context for other Filipino-American fights for social and academic justice. Now I'll hand it off to my colleague, Zara.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zara, and this next lesson plan takes a look at Filipino-American nurses and why nursing is such a central piece of the Filipino-American experience. So as of 2021, Filipinos represent 1% of the overall American population, but are actually 4% of the nursing population. And so this slight overrepresentation can be explained by understanding the history of U.S. colonization of the Philippines, as Andrew touched on, as well as various immigration laws in the 20th century and some economic factors and labor conditions in the Philippines. So nursing schools were initially established in the Philippines in the early 1900s after the Philippine-American War. And after that, nursing shortages caused by World War II initiated a labor migration pattern that would only be strengthened by immigration laws that were created in the mid-60s. Economic recession in the Philippines starting in the 80s actually pushed more Filipino nurses looking for higher wages to the US and other countries. And that further contributed to strengthening the Filipino-American nurses' migration pattern to the States. The major learning goals of this lesson include understanding how push-pull factors play into immigration patterns, as well as understanding the impact that Filipino-American nurses had in frontline medical care during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this particular topic is significant because it does talk about different threshold concepts related to American colonial history, migration patterns, and the impact of Filipino-Americans in frontline healthcare work. So that's it.
In a country that consistently issues xenophobia and colonialism as the norm, recognizing differences within community groups is so critical. The isolation that can be felt by these communities when the people surrounding them are inhospitable can be so overwhelming. Teaching students to understand these feelings through stories told allows them to empathize with discriminated communities and recognize the consequences of others and their own actions. Following this, you will see students discussing their lesson plans and how they best believe these pieces of literature can benefit the students who are taught them.
Hi, my name is Imani Spence, and I wrote the lesson plan about Carlos Bulosan's America is in the Heart, which was originally published in 1943 and served as a representative text about Filipino American struggles with immigration, labor rights, and xenophobia in California. Bulosan is a very prolific writer who worked considerably in labor organizing as well as poetry throughout his life. Growing up, he lived in Seattle in America and also lived around the Philippines as a child. In America is in the Heart, Bulosan uses anecdotes and stories from other Filipino Americans, as well as his own life, to create a semi-autobiographical novel that characterizes how Filipino Americans were feeling during a time of major upheaval in both America as well as the Philippines. Using the Filipino-American War as well as the World War II as contextualizing points, this lesson plan helps students consider what they believe to be helpful and useful about America today. For example, there is a Think, Pair, Share, which focuses on an excerpt from the piece that asks, why does it feel like it was a crime to be Filipino in California during this time? The goal with this lesson plan is that students are able to learn the impact of Carlos Bulosan's writing on the Filipino-American representation, as well as identify political statements that Bulosan was making, and begin to construct their own ideas for the future of America and how they relate to them.
Hi, my name's Danny.
Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem.
American popular culture is more than Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. It is more than the Pledge of Allegiance and Dorothy and her red shoes. American history is the people from all over the world that came here. And American history is the people who were forcibly brought here. In teaching American history, we can no longer erase this as we encourage our students to be learners. This collection of lesson plans focus on Filipino Americans in entertainment. These 5 lessons cover fashion, culinary arts, pop, rock, rap music, and film. We emphasize that Filipino American history is American history.
Fashion is a way for us to express who we are and where we come from. The way people dress tells us about their style as well as their culture and customs. Fashion can also help us learn about the wider history of a group of people. From traditional clothing to streetwear, Filipino Americans have used fashion to tell the story of who they are and push back on stereotypes. They are also innovators in the fashion industry today. In this lesson, students will learn about Filipino American history through fashion. By looking at Filipino students' decision to adopt American-style clothing during the early 20th century, students will learn how fashion challenges our perceptions of people and the ways that traditional clothing evolves as people assimilate into the dominant culture. Next, students will look at the stylish men of the Manong generation to learn about how they used zoot suits and Macintosh suits to distance themselves from their lower status as agricultural workers and look like the movie stars of the 1920s and 1930s. They'll also learn about how these suits contributed to Filipino immigration to the United States. Finally, students will learn about designers Nick Leak, who is the founder of Antisocial Social Club, and Lonnie Alabanza Barcena, a pioneer in women's streetwear, to discuss Filipino American contributions to streetwear and how they have pushed the fashion industry forward. By learning about Filipino American fashion of the past and the present, Students will think about how they use fashion to express themselves and consider the stories behind the clothing in their own culture.